June 2, 1944. Southeastern England, Dover. The morning fog clung to the white cliffs like a shroud, thick and cold against the skin. Below, in the marshalling yards near the coast, the rumble of diesel engines broke the dawn silence. Tank treads ground against gravel. Radio operators barked coordinates into crackling handsets. The metallic clink of ammunition belts being loaded echoed across the tent rows. From the cliffs above, German reconnaissance pilots would have seen exactly what they expected. The mighty American First Army Group, FUSAG, assembled, armed, and ready to strike across the narrowest point of the English Channel. General George S. Patton himself stood at the center of it all, his ivory-handled revolvers gleaming in the pale light, his voice booming orders that carried across the encampment like thunder. To any observer, this was the spearhead of the Allied invasion. This was the force that would punch through Hitler's Atlantic Wall at Pas-de-Calais. But it was all a lie. Every tank was inflatable rubber. Every truck was painted plywood mounted on Jeep frames. Every radio transmission was scripted theater. And the greatest deception of the Second World War had just begun. In the spring of 1944, the Allied command faced an impossible riddle. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, would succeed or fail not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the minds of German generals hundreds of miles away. The Wehrmacht had 50 divisions stationed across France and the Low Countries, a formidable force capable of throwing any amphibious assault back into the sea if concentrated at the right place. Intelligence estimates were grim. If the Germans knew where the Allies would land, they could reinforce Normandy within 48 hours and turn the beaches into a slaughterhouse. But if the Germans could be convinced the invasion would come elsewhere, at Calais perhaps, or Norway, those divisions would remain frozen in place, waiting for a phantom army that would never arrive. The task fell to a most unlikely unit. They were artists, sound engineers, set designers, advertising executives, and radio actors, men who had spent their lives crafting illusions for Hollywood studios and Broadway stages. Now they would craft the grandest illusion of all. Officially designated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, they would become known by a simpler name, the Ghost Army. 1,500 men armed not with rifles, but with paintbrushes, loudspeakers, and radio transmitters. Their mission was not to kill Germans, but to fool them so completely that the enemy would make the fatal mistake of fighting a war against shadows. The deception began with a simple truth. German intelligence was good, very good. Their Enigma intercepts, their aerial reconnaissance, their network of spies across neutral Europe, all of it fed into the Abwehr's analysts, who pored over every scrap of information like archaeologists sifting sand. The Allies could not simply hide their invasion plans. They had to feed the Germans a different story, one so convincing, so detailed, so corroborated by multiple sources that it would become the truth in the enemy's mind. And at the heart of that story was George S. Patton. Patton was the one German general after German general feared most. After his stunning armor campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, the Wehrmacht considered him the Allies' most dangerous field commander. Bold, aggressive, unpredictable. Erwin Rommel himself had studied Patton's tactics, noting in his personal diary that the American general understands mechanized warfare better than any of his peers. German intelligence tracked Patton obsessively. Where Patton went, they believed, the main Allied thrust would follow. So the Allies gave him exactly what they wanted to see. Patton in England, commanding FUSAG, preparing to invade at Calais. The first phase of the deception was visual. In the marshalling areas around Dover and the Thames estuary, the Ghost Army erected an entire phantom military installation. Dummy landing craft bobbed in harbors, wooden frames covered with canvas, painted to look weathered and operational from the air. Inflatable Sherman tanks sat in neat rows across the fields, their rubber skins stretched over metal frames that could be assembled by 6 men in 15 minutes. From 5,000 feet, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Fake oil storage depots, complete with smoke generators to simulate activity. Plywood artillery pieces positioned behind camouflage netting. Even laundry lines strung between tents, with uniforms hanging in the wind, because Ghost Army officers understood that German photo analysts looked for such details to confirm a unit's presence. But visual deception alone was not enough. The Germans would listen as carefully as they looked. This was where the Ghost Army's true innovation emerged. Sonic deception on a scale never before attempted. The unit's engineers had created what they called heater programs, recordings of military activity captured on massive wire spools. The sound of M4 Sherman tanks moving in convoy, the grinding of bulldozers clearing earth, the clatter of half-tracks, and the idling rumble of troop transport trucks. These recordings were played through arrays of powerful speakers mounted on vehicles, creating what one sergeant described as a symphony of war. A single speaker could project sound up to 15 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. Placed strategically near German listening posts, these sonic illusions could convince enemy intelligence that an entire armored division was moving through the darkness when in reality, only a handful of jeeps with loudspeakers prowled the roads. The Ghost Army practiced their craft like musicians rehearsing for Carnegie Hall. They learned the precise acoustic signature of every American vehicle, every piece of equipment. They understood that a Sherman tank in first gear produced a different engine note than one in third. They knew that German sound-ranging operators could estimate the size of a unit by counting the number of distinct engine sounds in a convoy. So the Ghost Army alternated their recordings, mixing silences and irregular starts, added the squeal of stuck gears and the barked orders of imaginary sergeants. They made their phantom units sound human, fallible, real. But the most sophisticated element of the deception was the radio game. German signals intelligence units, the Funkaufklärung, had become devastatingly effective by 1944. They monitored every Allied radio frequency, tracking call signs, identifying operators by their unique fist, the distinctive rhythm with which each radio man tapped out Morse code. The Germans maintained detailed logs, which units transmitted at what times, what frequencies they used, what encryption patterns they followed. They could identify a division's location simply by triangulating its radio traffic. The Allies knew this, and they turned it into a weapon. The Ghost Army Signal Company Special became the most critical component of a deception. These were radio operators trained not just in communication, but in performance. Each man studied the transmission patterns of real units, how often they sent messages, what kind of traffic they generated, even the individual quirks of specific operators. When the Ghost Army needed to simulate the First Army Group under Patton's command, their radio men didn't simply broadcast random chatter. They created entire fictional order of battle networks, complete with command hierarchies, supply requests, reconnaissance reports, and the mundane administrative traffic that accompanies any real military formation. They transmitted in low-level codes the Germans had already broken, ensuring the Abwehr would intercept and decrypt their messages. The content was carefully calibrated, realistic enough to be believable, but seeded with just enough detail to reinforce the Calais invasion narrative. A Phantom Engineer Battalion requesting bridge pontoons for crossing the Somme. A fictional quartermaster unit ordering maps of the Pas-de-Calais region. A simulated reconnaissance report describing German coastal defenses near Boulogne. Day after day, week after week, the Ghost Army's transmitters hummed with false intelligence, building a complete alternative reality in the minds of German commanders. The Germans naturally suspected deception. They were not fools. But the sheer consistency of the intelligence, visual reconnaissance confirming troop concentrations, radio intercepts corroborating unit movements, even reports from double agents controlled by British counterintelligence, created what intelligence analysts call confirmation cascade. Each piece of false evidence reinforced the others. The dummy tanks confirmed what the radio traffic suggested. The radio traffic explained what the aerial photographs showed. And at the center of it all stood Patton, making public appearances in Dover, attending social functions where German spies were known to operate, even delivering speeches that were deliberately leaked through neutral diplomatic channels. The Germans saw what they expected to see, their most dangerous adversary preparing for the most obvious invasion route. What they could not see was a real invasion force assembling 200 miles to the west in the harbors and staging areas around Portsmouth and Southampton, aimed not at Calais but at the beaches of Normandy. German intelligence reports from May 1944 reveal the completeness of a deception. Abwehr estimates place FUSAG strength at 11 divisions, nearly 150,000 men, concentrated in southeastern England. Wehrmacht planning documents show that German 15th Army, stationed at Pas-de-Calais, remained at full strength throughout June, convinced that Patton's assault was imminent. Even after the Normandy landings began on June 6, Hitler himself insisted the operation was merely a diversion, that the real invasion, Patton's invasion, would still come at Calais. For 7 critical weeks after D-Day, the German 15th Army sat frozen in place, waiting for phantom divisions that would never arrive. 19 divisions, 200,000 men, the largest and best-equipped force in France, paralyzed by an illusion created by 1,500 artists with rubber tanks and radio sets. The soldiers of the Ghost Army themselves understood the weight of what they carried, though they could not speak of it. In letters home, heavily censored, they described their work in oblique terms. One sergeant wrote to his wife, "We paint pictures here, darling, but not the kind I made in the studio. These have to be perfect from very far away." Another, a former sound engineer for RKO Pictures, noted in his diary, "Today we moved an entire armor division 30 miles. It took us 4 hours and 12 men. I don't think the fellows who do it for real would believe it if they saw it. They lived under extraordinary security restrictions. They could not tell anyone outside the unit what they did. They wore standard infantry insignia and carried weapons like any other soldiers, but their actual work remained invisible, unacknowledged, uncelebrated. And yet they knew that every day the Germans remained deceived was a day fewer men would die on the Normandy beaches. They knew that every phantom division they conjured into existence was a real division that would not reinforce the Atlantic Wall. They knew that their illusions were saving lives by the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, even if they would never receive credit for it. The Ghost Army's operations continued throughout the European campaign, long after D-Day. They deceived German forces at the Battle of Brest, creating phantom buildups that drew enemy forces away from the actual Allied advance. They simulated the presence of the 2nd Armored Division near the German border, convincing Wehrmacht commanders that American forces were far stronger in that sector than they actually were. At the Rhine crossing in March 1945, Ghost Army loudspeakers broadcast the sounds of bridge construction at multiple false sites, dispersing German artillery fire, while the real bridging operations proceeded unmolested 15 miles south. In total, the unit conducted more than 20 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Their operational reports, declassified decades later, claim they routinely deceived enemy forces at the divisional level, between 10 and 15,000 men per operation, and in several cases, including the D-Day deception, misled entire army groups comprising multiple corps and dozens of divisions. But perhaps the most profound impact was not tactical, but psychological. The German officer corps had prided itself on military excellence, on the superiority of German intelligence, on the professionalism of the Wehrmacht's operational planning. To have been so thoroughly, so completely deceived, not by technological superiority, not by overwhelming force, but by creativity and imagination, struck at the heart of that professional identity. In post-war interrogations, German generals struggled to explain how they had been fooled. They had seen the tanks. They had heard the radio traffic. They had tracked Patton's movements. Every source confirmed the Calais scenario. The deception was so complete that many German officers initially refused to believe it even after the war ended, insisting that FUSAG must have been real, that the Allies had simply changed their plans at the last moment. The Ghost Army had done something extraordinary. They had outthought, out-imagined, and outperformed one of history's most formidable military machines, not through violence, but through art, not through destruction, but through creation. In the decades after the war, the Ghost Army remained classified, their story untold. The men who had served in the unit returned to civilian life, to advertising agencies and film studios, to art schools and radio stations, carrying secrets they could not share. It was not until 1996 that the unit's full operational records were declassified, revealing the scope of their achievements. By then, many of the original Ghost Army soldiers had passed away, their contributions unrecognized, their names absent from the histories of the war they had helped win. But in those records lies a truth larger than military history. The Ghost Army proved that wars are won not only by those who fight, but by those who think. That imagination can be as powerful as artillery. That 1,500 artists could achieve what 15 divisions might not. In an age of mechanized warfare and industrial-scale destruction, they demonstrated that the human capacity for creativity and deception remained the ultimate weapon, one that could not be manufactured in factories or counted on spreadsheets, but that could change the course of history as decisively as any army. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most profound deception of all, making the enemy believe in their own certainty, when certainty itself was the illusion. The ghost army understood what the Germans could not. That in war as an art, what appears to be true matters more than what is true. They painted reality itself, stroke by stroke, transmission by transmission, rubber tank by rubber tank, until fiction became fact in the minds of their enemies. June 2nd, 1944. Dover. The fog lifts. The phantom army stirs. And across the channel, German spotters adjust their field glasses, noting in their logs exactly what they are meant to see. The greatest show on earth has begun, performed for an audience that will never know they bought a ticket to their own defeat. In the cold morning air, the hum of radio transmitters carries across the cliffs, the sound of 1,500 voices speaking in perfect unison, crafting victory from silence, shadows, and the stubborn refusal to fight the war anyone expected.